It's never easy to win on demand, especially when your opponent is a strong international master and one of the most promising young talents from the UK. This is the story of my first international master norm. Most British players are very well prepared, and my opponent is no exception. Judging by his games, it would be very difficult for me to get any sort of opening advantage from the main lines. In fact, it would be more than likely that the game would fizzle out into a quick draw, and that would not be acceptable given that I needed a win to get my first international master norm. So I came up with a very good strategy. I decided to forego any hopes of an opening advantage, but instead to try to keep the structure flexible and to keep as many pieces on the board as possible. And this would lead to a very complex game, giving me very good winning chances, especially as my opponent was not in the best shape during this tournament. So from what we've already discussed, you can probably guess that we're looking for a sideline, but not just any sideline. It had to be something that's less popular that he might not have known. So he decided to play the move b3, which at the time wasn't quite as popular as it is now. Black played move d5, bishop b2, bishop f5. And he was actually playing quite quickly, which sort of indicates to me that he had looked at this line before, but he also seemed slightly hesitant after a few moves. And here he started taking quite a bit more time. e6, now g3. So I'm simply putting my pieces in a way to prepare the move e4. Knight c6. Now already the move e4 was possible and perhaps it was stronger, but I wanted to keep things flexible. So I decided I'd play the move knight f3 and later I decide whether to push c4 or e4. Black plays h6, castles, bishop e7, now knight e5. So again, we are opening up this bishop and preparing moves like e4 and c4. They take on e5, bishop takes e5, castles, and now c4. Now the move e4 was possible, and it's a move that I seriously considered. But what I really didn't like was that after bishop g6, ed5, ed5, now the most logical move is queen f3, hitting this pawn on d5. And pushing the pawn would be a bad idea because then b7 would hang. But unfortunately, I didn't see a very good response to the move queen d7. And the idea being that he wants to play the move rook d8 and protect this pawn on d5. And if we play the move bishop f6, then unfortunately bishop f6 is hitting the rook on a1, which means we don't have enough time to take this pawn on d5. As after rook d1 or rook e1, black simply defends the pawn. So we decided to hit black's center in another way, playing the move c4. And obviously black is not going to do anything, his center is quite stable, so he just plays rook c8. And that's why we're trying to force matters with the move e4. Now the move e4 is not usually combined with the move c4, because in many cases this weakens a lot of dark squares, especially this central square on d4. But in this case, we've already traded off black's knight on c6, which makes it a lot harder for black to occupy this square on d4. In addition, black's pieces aren't exactly the most active, and it's not that easy for his inactive pieces to make use of our weaknesses. So here black comes up with a very ambitious plan. He plays d takes e4, and after d takes e4, now bishop g4, hitting the queen on d1. f3 is pretty much forced, and bishop h5. So why did he spend so much time with the bishop? Well, this is actually a very ambitious idea, because he's trying to force all our pawns to the light squares. And after that, he will try to trade off the dark square bishops, and to take full control over the dark squares. It's a very sound positional idea, but concretely, I'm not sure it really works. Now queen e2 was played, and here black played knight d7. Now positionally, this is a very desirable move, but as I suspected during the game, he missed a very simple tactical detail. So obviously my bishop has to go back to c3, and now of course black wanted to play the move bishop f6. As I suspected, he had missed that after e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes, queen takes e5, queen takes d2. Actually, the bishop on h5 is hanging, so black would lose a piece. So after bishop c3, black cannot play bishop f6, and instead he played queen c7. So now he really is threatening the move bishop f6, but we are in time to stop it with the move e5. Rook cd8, not much else that I can recommend for black. His position is starting to look more and more cramped with each move. g4, hitting the bishop on h5, bishop g6, and now f4. So we are going for a huge kingside attack now. f4 to f5 is a killing threat, which absolutely forces black's next move. f5, e takes f6. That's the only way to play for an advantage. We need to create some sort of weakness on e6 and try to target it. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes, and here a bit of a surprising decision, because I was expecting black to play the move rook takes f6, defending this pawn on e6. And after g5, rook takes f4, gh6 takes, and queen e5. I calculated to this point and really it just looked completely unclear to me. However, my opponent was understandably worried about position after queen g4, because it does look a bit scary. We do have some threats along the black king, but turns out that after queen d4 check, the endgame is pretty good for black, because after takes and bishop b7, Black now has the move knight c5, followed by g takes h6. Instead, black played the move knight f6, which was a real pleasant surprise. As you can imagine, my opponent is quite a strong player, so he obviously had a good idea. That is, after queen takes e6, he was about to play bishop f7, after queen e2, to play knight takes g4. And if I take the knight, then the rook will take my knight on d2. So this will actually be a very nice position for black. But after knight takes e6, he underestimated my next move. That is the move g5. So now I'm immediately kicking his knight away. In fact, knight h5 is practically forced. Queen takes e6 check, and now king h7. Now, after the game, I asked him why didn't he play the move bishop f7? And he told me that he wasn't so fond of the move queen e3. And after rook f8, knight e4, yes, it is an extra pawn for white. But indeed, this would have been the lesser evil compared to what happened in the game. After the move king h7, it looks like black has some counterplay because he's hitting the pawn on f4 as well as the knight on d2. But here he missed a strong counter attack with the move f5. So I'm immediately hitting the bishop on g6, bishop e8, otherwise g6 would be nasty, and now knight e4, saving the knight and bringing it to the action. Black was counting on the move knight f4, but judging by his reaction, he had missed my next move. I first started with the move g6, and after king h8, I simply sacrificed the exchange on f4. Queen takes f4, and now queen e7. We have a pawn for the exchange, as well as some immediate threats. For instance, we have a mate in one threat with queen takes f8. So black moves the bishop to c6, which looks very logical. This also doesn't work, because now the move f6 is killing. Obviously, we cannot take on f6 with the pawn, because that's mate in one. If you play rook takes f6, then the rook on d8 hangs. And otherwise, it's impossible to stop some sort of action on g7. So black is dead lost here. Which means that the only move for black is to give back a piece with bishop takes g6, f takes g6. And materially, it seems like black is doing alright, as his pieces are really quite active and our king looks a bit airy. But the real hero of the game is my knight on e4, which is controlling all the key squares like f2, d2. Now I can check on e3, that's fine, I can go king h1. Again, all the key squares are under control. Rook f8, black doesn't really have much else to do. He hits the queen, and now we simply pick up another pawn. Rook d6, a fancy move. So obviously, we can't take this rook at all because queen d4 check, and suddenly we can resign. With the king h1, queen takes a1, with mate next move. But of course we don't take the rook. Instead, I found a very strong reply. Queen f7. Now we are hitting the rook on e8, and black has to do something about it. So he gives a check on e3, king h1, and he brings back his rook to d8. Now we bring our last piece into the attack, rook f1. And as you'll soon see, the weakness of the black king will soon play a decisive role, a5. In this position, I could have won instantly with a very simple tactic. Knight d6. So we're immediately threatening the rook on e8, and if black takes the rook, then queen f8 check is a back rank mate. So after knight d6, the only way to save the rook is to play rook g8. But here, white can win in any number of ways. Prettiest is queen takes g8. So if rook takes g8, that's a smothered mate with knight f7. And if king takes g8, then we have a nice windmill maneuver. After bishop d5, king h8 is only move, knight f7 check, king g8 is only move, knight takes d8, discovered check, and rook f8 mate. So that would have been a very nice and simple way to finish off the game. But instead I played the move queen f5, which was very much a waste of time, because after queen e2, black wants to take on a2, and he's gonna get some counterplay. Now I finally spotted this idea with knight d6 and played it, but this is much less effective now, because black has to move queen takes f1. And after bishop takes f1, rook takes d6, the position is obviously winning, but this is gonna take some time to convert. And it's also worth mentioning the psychological aspect, which we talk about a lot on this channel. In this game, I knew that a win would give me my first international master norm, and knowing that I was so close to the goal was certainly a bit unnerving. And as you can see, my subsequent moves were a bit shaky. Rook went to d8, bishop e2, rook d2, now I played queen e5, good centralizing move. He took the pawn, but no worries, I simply bring the king, h4, now my king comes in, king goes to e3, and finally I get to pick up this pawn on c5. And after a few more moves, we ended up trading the A pawn for his B pawn. Now when we got to this point, I was quite happy to see this, because even though we have exchanged of quite a bit, but this position is very stable and we can slowly push our B pawn down. And as long as we're not too careless, this should be quite a simple win. Rook c2, queen e5, we're simply centralizing our pieces. Now we start to push the pawn. Bishop c4, we're slowly cutting off black's pieces as well. King g3, And after more maneuvering, we finally end up getting this pawn to b7, queen c5, and rook goes back to f8. Queen e7, rook e8, queen a3, rook b8. So black is simply waiting on the 8th rank, because he really doesn't have much better to do. Queen b3, rook b8. And now comes the next stage of my plan. We want to put our bishop on c8, because that would then cut the coordination of the black rooks and would allow me to either queen I pawn or to win one of his rooks for my pawn on b7. So now bishop g4, rook b8, queen c3, taking control over the c8 square. Rook f1, bishop c8, rook b1. Black is desperately trying to stop b8 queen, but that's not going to work for very long. So now I simply play queen d4. I'm not in a rush to get the pawn through. I simply want to get it through in the safest possible way, without allowing any unnecessary checks. Rook b5, king g4, protecting the pawn. Rook b3, now queen f4. And now it's completely unstoppable. b8 queen is coming up, winning the rook. So my opponent tried rook c3, but the two rooks are no match for my two queens. So my opponent played rook g8. Obviously, he could see what was coming up, but it was very sportsmanlike to allow this. Yes, I'm sure all of you can see the winning move. Queen takes h6. In fact, I spent over a minute double checking this move and really just enjoying myself. G takes h6 and queen h7 mate. Making my final norm was a huge relief. After countless hours of hard work, I finally had something to show for my efforts. It was also a catalyst for me to make my second norm, which if you'd like to see that, then hit the like button for this video. And if I can get 50 likes, then I'll also cover the game that made me my second norm. Thanks for watching and bye for now.